Welcome to the May 2026 Roots Action Education Fund Book Club. My name is David Swanson. I'm the campaign coordinator at Roots Action Education Fund. We are fortunate to have with us this evening to help me out with hosting and asking questions and discussing this month's book, Norman Solomon, who founded the Institute for Public Accuracy in 1997 and is its executive director. He has been immersed in anti-war, social justice, environmental movements since the late 60s. He's the author of a dozen books, including War Made Invisible, War Made Easy, Made Love, Got War. He is also co-founder and national director of Roots Action Education Fund. And we are extremely privileged to have with us this month the author of this terrific book, which you need to read if you haven't already read in preparation for being here and asking questions. Left Behind: The Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality, by our guest Lily Geismer, who is an associate professor of history at Claremont McKenna College. She researches and teaches about recent political and urban history in the US with a focus on liberalism and the Democratic Party. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, Washington Post, New Republic, Jacobin, Dissent, and on NPR and other podcasts. Lily Geismer is a native of Massachusetts, currently residing in Los Angeles. Lily, welcome to the book club.
Thanks so much for inviting me.
Thank you for being here. I just want to tell everybody quickly that this is being recorded. There will be a video. We will send it to everybody. And there is a chat where you can ask questions starting right now and through, 59 minutes in. You can ask questions of Lily Geismer about the book Left Behind. And if you want to wait till the discussion gets going to put your questions there, that's fine. But at any time, put in your questions and we'll ask them. Let's maybe start, Lily, with what's the basic idea behind the book? Why write this book? What did you hope people would learn?
Yeah, so as you brought up, I've spent a lot of my career studying the Democrats and liberalism and sort of thinking about their transformations in a number of different ways. And the purpose with this book was to sort of understand how and why the Democrats came to embrace more market-based ideologies. So traditionally, those are ideas that are sort of more associated with the Republican Party. But I really wanted to understand how and why Democrats came to kind of embrace these ideas, especially sort of after the 1970s. So it traces that logic first with a group of people known as who are known as the Watergate babies, up through the kind of the Clinton years. And in some ways, one of the things I was interested in is like oftentimes people describe this idea that the reasons that figures, especially Bill Clinton, came to embrace the market and versions of economic growth associated with it would have to do with kind of just they wanted to beat out the Republicans, and so it was only like in just defensive response to Republicans. And so I really wanted to show the kind of commitment to this as an idea, and particularly the ways in which they believed in the kind of idea that market-based solutions could address and particularly address problems of inequality, so that they could use the market to think about to address things that sort of traditional Democrats thought about. And the thing that I wanted to kind of with that look at is the ways in which these logics might have contributed to kind of some of the Democratic Party's success in the 1990s, in particular like recapturing the presidency, but how a lot of the policies quote unquote left many people behind. So they encouraged particular kinds of growth in areas like trade, finance, and tech, but oftentimes left behind people who were not, and that the kind of versions of growth, people in places who are not sort of associated with those industries. So the 90s might have had overall economic growth, but I think it left the overall economy in a much more vulnerable position. So that was a key piece of it. That was a key piece of the argument as well.
An important, maybe not a cheerful story, but an important one. Norman, would you like to ask a question as I remind everybody to put their questions in the chat and we will ask them?
Yeah, well, first I want to echo, I mean, this is a terrific book. And part of what you were saying, Lily, reminds me, of course, of NAFTA. And then the Telecommunications Reform Act of 1996, the so-called welfare reform of 1996, seemed to have an initial jolt of popularity, but then had an erosion quality in terms of the base. And how would you describe the impact going into the 21st century?
Yeah, so I think, I mean, so one of the there's a question of kind of in terms of like the political, the kind of political dimensions. I think that and the other thing I will actually say, so the other thing I was interested in the book and the other way of reading like the play on words like left behind is like how the left actually got left behind in this process.
Mhm.
And so increasingly some of the you can watch the kind of remaking of the Democratic Party's policy priorities, but also its electoral base and coalition through this happening. And so one of the things I was really interested in invested in is sort of understanding through this particular Democrats, especially the kind of moving away from organized labor as having a kind of say and voice in the the Democratic Party in a number of different ways. And so that was one of the questions that I had is like as they kind of make decisions to prioritize certain kinds of policies and people, um, that will enormous that like that how that kind of came to reshape the party. I will say some of the questions about like the short term rates, I mean, and this can get a little bit weedsy, is in some ways there's some of this has to do with like some of the sort of singularity of Bill Clinton himself and like his ability to speak to sort of multiple audiences. I think he was a very like charismatic politician. I talk about that. I actually spend like when you I've spent way too much time in Bill Clinton's brain over the last decade of my life, and I will say like I mean it's impressive in some of the ways in which his ability to speak to multiple audiences. So I think some ways like he was able to break down certain kinds of things in ways that were like popular, like that became like popular and like led to like a big growth. I think the other thing that happened is that like over the 90s you see this overall economic growth. So people had a sense of like the economy is doing really well. And that's sort of a question around. So if you look immediately at NAFTA, even though NAFTA itself was quite controversial when it was when it was passed, the I think the question was like the long-term effects, and especially with one thing I look at with the Democrats is like a lot of promises that something was going to come. So like it's okay if we invest in tech and trade, because eventually, like, and I always use this example of like, like we're going to retrain you for new jobs. So like looking at places like going to like rural North Carolina, where there's, the textile industry had been like decimated in the 90s. And like that's okay because jobs will come. And I think for many people, like increasingly, like those jobs did not come. And I think the other side of it is that if you the question with welfare, which also speaks to like I look at extensive in the book at welfare, which speaks to sort of certain kinds of logics and especially the idea of putting people to work. But I think that the other piece of that is like it also left people without a kind of critical safety net going in. And so so instead it sort of one of the things that I trace is kind of how Democrats increasingly like looked to the market as a new sort of social safety net, so that you could like the market could address the functions that once the state did. And what happens in the 2000s and beyond is like as we have things like the recession, it cannot serve that role.
the
Yeah.
the damage that was done to welfare and public housing and public services and the good that was never done in terms of taxing the rich or doing anything about inequality and so forth. You mentioned winning and victory, and Clinton got elected twice, but they pretty quickly, the Democrats lost seats in Congress, right? And what about the longer term impact? I mean, to what extent over the subsequent years have people connected the failures with everything in their lives getting worse, and the losses compounded with a delayed reaction?
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of that. I mean, I think you want like it's not. I mean, to sort of look like the to sort of think about this question of like where does responsibility lie in some ways, and I don't and that's I think one of the reasons like NAFTA gets a lot of attention or other kinds of moments, and to sort of these promises the Democrats have made for so long without kind of coming to fruition. And so I think what it has happened is it's turned into kind of significant alienation towards the Democrats themselves. And so that's one thing we've seen really play out in the last decade, in a number, like in all these different forms. I think both in the left and the right, just turn to this kind of mainstream Democratic Party ethos. So absolutely, like it is not delivered for many people.
One thing comes to mind. I mean, every president I can remember had some complaints about journalists and media and so forth. But it's from what I remember, Clinton was really beloved by a lot of journalists, maybe including the policy wonking kind of people, since he was considered the, preeminent policy wonk of the era. And I wanted to ask you about that generally, but also specifically the role of E.J. Dionne and his book, Why American Hates Politics, because it was a mutual love affair, I think, in 1991. I remember it really propelled, it was good for E.J. Dionne, but this whole thing about responsibility, they love that stuff that people who benefit from social services, they need to have responsibility.
Yeah, I think that I mean, so there's a couple of different things. And so one question I had actually, like, and I don't know if you did on, but like going back to this question of like the coalition, like I was really interested in, but with is like the ways in which there was not more opposition to amongst the left to Bill Clinton in the 1990s. Like I was like, where
Yeah.
is the friction? And I think what happened was like you had it on certain issues. So like people were really upset, by like there was a lot of opposition to welfare reform and like amongst social justice groups, amongst feminists, like but it wasn't ever like a unified opposition. So it's like it was on particular issues, not ever coming together. So that actually allowed for a lot of things to happen. I think one of the other things that comes up, and this goes to the earlier question, which I'm happy to talk about, and I go into the book in the kind of, I look extensively at the Democratic Leadership Council and their role, but they of kind of remaking the Democratic Party and its priorities in the 80s. But one thing that they did this famous autopsy after the 1980 election. And like one of the things that they really focused on was this idea of like focusing on the presidency. Like if the Democrats win the presidency, then that's the ball game essentially, which in
Mm.
some ways was the fact that they'd held Congress for like 40 years. So it felt like it was just like Democrats would always have Congress. But I think that also has created long-term like impacts and then what happens in the 1990s is the Democrats don't hold Congress anymore, but they still don't really invest in like congressional candidates or congressional races as like the place to kind of build power. So that has certain kinds of like a certain kind of impact. But I think that this idea, to go back to the question of like the alienation with like with to going back to the EJ Dionne question, like this idea of like Americans being fed up with politics and Bill Clinton's ability to like connect with that did actually hold some short-term power. And I think, some people have looked at, and there's the book by Nelson Lichtenstein that looks at this more in depth than I do on Clinton, called The Fabulous Failure, is he ran in 1992 as a more of an economic populist in 1992 than what you saw happen
Yeah.
subsequently. So and
Yeah.
quickly shifted policies, and so you can sort of look at the ins and outs that like and I think that goes to speaking to multiple audiences too. So that did connect with certain people who were frustrated with politics and the ability to kind of bring those voters in various different ways.
Yeah.
And Nelson brought me into politics as we worked for a living wage at the University of Virginia. I want to start taking some questions from the chat, but Norman, you and I can jump in as appropriate. But
Yeah.
the first question I see, and everybody else, put your questions in the chat. This is a question: the jobs will come. Quote: Is that the Democrats' version of trickle down economics?
It's a good way to think about it. I mean, I think that some of the idea is like that this is growth that will be good for everyone. And so that goes back to your discussion of like things like the ways that and I don't think this was all just selling. Like I think they actually like the thing I came to for writing this book is like they actually believed in the power of the market to do good. So I look extensively at programs like micro enterprise and like these kinds
Yeah.
of programs that became really popular. And there was like this faith that like these are the market can provide these kinds of things, or like tech jobs can provide, like it is the best mechanism. So yes, I think that there was an idea that like the ways that and like the Democratic Party or Democrats like Bill Clinton, I'll use him the same for all Democrats, but thought about things like all the major kind of deregulations of the 1990s was that like this will be good for like consumers and workers, and this will help people in various different ways, like if we provide these kinds of things. And I should say like one thing that's really important is the Democratic Party has always been about, I mean, sort of or liberalism since like the night, not always, but like since the night at least the 30s onward, had a commitment to growth, like an economic growth, and that really is the party, the liberalism of the post-war era. So this became a way of like continuing that, but without, as I think came up, like without actually like a jobs guarantee. So it's not saying like the jobs will come and we will like we're going to provide you those jobs by investing in things like infrastructure or other types of things. Instead, it's like the market's going to do those kinds of things. And so that leads to this kind of like fundamental mismatch that happens where you see a lot of growth happening, but at the top and not to people who actually don't ever, you know, like are not turned into coders. And I should say the other thing that comes up is like that never get the jobs back, like the sort of stable jobs that were once provided by manufacturing in other places, other industries.
One of their frames was job training, but where are the jobs?
There's also a lot of focus in the book on these projects they came up with, these schemes around local investment banks and microcredit, mini loans, that it seems, according to your research, if I understand, there wasn't any evidence that these would succeed, and they were never attempted on remotely the scale to do, the sort of national project that was needed. And so I have this question as I'm reading through: how much of this is sincere stupidity and how much of this is corruption, and how much, what other motivations, what are the motivations, for something that looks like it won't work, doesn't work, and they just keep at it?
Yeah, I mean, isn't it amazing? Like their relentless commitment to certain kinds of like certain failures. Like I'm the one I always blows my mind, and this is not just like is like which I talk about in the book, but like has been tried by like actually like Trump has finally seemed to give this up, and I don't, and Biden didn't really try it, but it's like in like the empowerment zone model, like everyone has tried this model, and like it's proven not to work, but it's like just rebranded as something else. And so I think that that idea of like being committed to these particular principles that are actually like quite small scale, and that's going to be a solution to like this like intense like economic dislocation that is happening from this larger scale transition does happen. And I will say something, like I always say this about like things like micro enterprise, which I spend a lot of time looking at. Like they're not terrible ideas. Like it's just that can't be the only thing that you offer. So like as a small scale, that they're just really small scale solutions. So it's like I always think about this, like it's like macro. It's often offering like micro solutions to macro problems. And so when you're offering things like micro enterprise to something that is like a massive macro problem, it just can never do those kinds of things. So I think it's a faith in the market, like, and in some ways, I think the other part of it is like things like the market education, these kinds of things, like they benefit particular Democrats. So, and like they've seen the benefits that it's had for them. So like the tech industry. So like, why don't we bring those to like, that can solve it for everybody? Is some of the logics that continually happen.
There is a question in the chat that's more of an answer. You can tell us if it's right or not, but it's sort of the corruption answer to my earlier question. It says in the 90s, with Clinton's New Democrats, they got tired of eating hot dogs with Joe Hardhat at the corner diner and saw the Republicans eating pate de foie gras at the Ritz-Carlton and wanted some. So they started courting the same big money as the Republicans, and NAFTA and gutting Glass-Steagall and big tech. And we had the internet bubble crash and so forth.
Yeah,
Correct?
I mean, I think it goes back further than that. So it wasn't just the 90s. Like I think you have this generation of Democrats who are like largely committed, and this goes to like the larger kind of like class transformation of the party that I've traced extensively at various different points. But I think that it starts really in the 70s. I mean, you have this group of this who Clinton is part of, like this new generation of Democrats coming in who like it's not so I don't think it's just corruption. Like I think that they actually like did believe that like things like tech would be better for the American economy. It does help that like those it like I don't think it's not like a coincidence that those also become big donors to the party, and that's also like who they are, that like who they're increasingly like talking to. So I look at this with like things like the tech industry, how people like Al Gore like forged close relationships with like the major like the major head of like the venture like big venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. So I do think that helps it, but I don't see it as like a straight corruption. It depends. I guess it depends on like the definition of corruption. Instead, I think that some of it has to do with like a faith in these particular um, economic mechanisms that benefit some people and don't benefit others.
Norman, jump in anytime.
Yeah, there's been, you could say, an abandonment of the New Deal in stages. I was surprised, I think it was in your book, where people like Al Fromm, some of the Democratic Leadership Council people, they were explicit. They wanted to dismantle the New Deal. I would have thought they would be more ashamed of that. But I remember when Bill Clinton campaigned in '92, he did talk about public investment, and he did sound like he was going to really invigorate some government spending for social programs and job stimulus and more Keynesian and so forth. But then you looked at his cabinet, right? His cabinet in '93, and then after his reelection, his cabinet was like more and more Wall Street, right?
Yeah, I mean, there's this idea, he has this two kind of sides of his economic strategies and policies. So there's like, it's often represented by like the two Roberts, so Robert Reich and Robert Reuben.
Yeah.
And one of the things is like, so if you look at Robert Reich played a much bigger role in the campaign agenda, like in writing the campaign agenda. So is putting people first, which is the Clinton Gore campaign, like with the like book basically with their agenda, has a lot about public investment, infrastructure, those kinds of things, as the kind of the policies. The other side of it was the kind of Robert Rubin explicitly like Wall Street side, which also had to do who were much more like, I mean, you have the deficit hawks basically. And so Rubin is first the head of the Council of Economic Advisors, but then becomes Secretary of Treasury, and is really critical to a lot of these kinds of ideas. I will say, like, I guess you asked like the question of like what did this thing that and so basically, like Clinton decides almost, and I was looking at the comment that just came in, like Clinton basically decides like almost in like February of 1993 that he's going to go the route of the deficit hawks. And essentially the
Mhm.
argument that Rubin makes is that like it's the deficit is scaring the bond market, and like that like they really like you need to have the bond market needs to be stable. And so therefore like what we should do is reduce the deficit, focus on that. And you can't really reduce the deficit and do a lot of infrastructure spending. So they take that approach, but a lot of it is about this idea of like restoring the confidence and growth of Wall Street, as like fundamental to the project. One thing I'll say, so you asked like what motivated the book or the questions that asked me, like one of the other ones I had, I thought about a lot actually, and this is like silly when you're reading a book, but I was like, why is Robert Rubin a Democrat? I want to like understand that question because I was like, I mean, it's just like what like there doesn't make sense to me, but actually was someone who like firmly believed in alleviating like that poverty should not be a problem, and actually like even when he was at Goldman Sachs had all of these like was doing a lot of work around issues of like poverty and inequality in like places like Harlem. And so I do think that was the driving factor. So like didn't care about like labor or like the working class, but did actually care about the poor. And so there was this idea of like the government's job is to help still like there's still some idea that government should help people and help the poor, but you do it through these much more like market oriented approaches than like a big redistributive approach or big social spending.
So
Yeah,
that
and when you look at, we've gone Gore, Kerry, Obama, Biden, but certainly it's kind of a cliche inflection point. But right when Obama first became president, there was all this brief speculation that he was going to launch enormous public investment, but it didn't happen. And I just wonder what you think about the continuity from the Clinton years to the present time in terms of the Democratic Party so-called leadership.
Yeah, I think it's huge. And I think that this is another fight like I have with people. Like there's this idea that like this goes back to like so in amongst historians, I guess more than anyone, but like I mean I guess another question I had the academic question, another when you asked like why I read the book was like to look at like that this idea like understanding like ideas of neoliberalism and to think about this like democratic version of neoliberalism that's different. So that was one thing I was parsing out. But the other side of this is like that everything isn't just because of the Republicans. Like, and it's not to say that like this was that like these people were operating in like a frictionless world with like that where there was no, they were facing substantial pushback from an increasingly powerful Republican Party. But I think one thing is like that you see through these choices that were made is like it is not like if there was no Newt Gingrich that it would have been like some like the 90s would have been this like socialist paradise where like Clinton would have done all these. I mean, I think that they really that was one of my ideas that they were really trying to like capture they had like a particular faith in these market-oriented ideas. But to go to your original question about the continuities, I think there's huge continuity, and I think you can see it especially like I thought a lot. I mean, the book doesn't talk that much about Obama, but I've actually done a lot of subsequent. I just finished an edited volume called Mastery and Drift about the rise of professional class liberals, who I think of Obama very much in like as the embodiment of that idea.
Yeah.
And I think you can see a lot of like his language was different, and I think like his personal story and the ideas of hope and change that like galvanized a lot of people. But a lot of the policy ideas are very, very similar to what you saw in the Clinton administration, and also like a lot of the same people, frankly, like they brought back a lot of the same on the economic front. So that came to govern the policy agenda and in all kinds of ways where you see a huge amount of continuity. And I definitely think there's like the legacy of that. I mean, I think Democrats like don't are not as euphoric in the way they celebrate the market because the moment has shifted, but some of the core idea, like you can still see some of these core principles play out. And I
Yeah.
think especially actually now, I will say that actually like there's been this whole in the last, I think since 2024, as we've seen this kind of fissures that were always there, but much more present, that actually has like enabled that those voices to come out of kind of like going back to some of the Clinton approaches.
Yeah.
This does relate to a question in the chat. If we could try to ask some of them, because I really do appreciate everybody putting great questions in the chat as we ask them to. And one of them is, if the claim back then was that the market could take over what the government was doing, but this didn't work, is there any current acknowledgement in the Democratic Party, or here it says the Democratic platform, or do they still support this market plan?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think that there are certain of the programs, because as they become like more politically unpopular, you don't see the same you don't have the same type of approach. So I will say one is like charter schools, which were like I wrote about in the book, but like were that was the hot topic of like the 90s to 2000 and like I would say like 17 or I don't know when I can't even date it when, but then there's been this like pull away from that. So some of those you don't have the same kind of like embrace, like micro enterprise is not something that Democrats are talking a ton about anymore. But I think that in other ways, like you can still see a lot of these ideas play out. And like I've written about this a fair amount, but like I think like Kamala Harris calling her camp like her agenda was like the opportunity economy. Like that's still these core ideas about like not actually putting forward any kind of like redistributive model, and instead really focusing on like the possibilities of like the market to produce more opportunity. And I think you saw a number of different ways where she actually even like walked back actually some of many of Biden's economic interventions to address those kinds of questions. So I think that that's a place where I see it still very much play out. So I think there's some acknowledgement, but never saying like we did. Like there's not, I mean, there's like some of the, I mean, I think you'll have a few of like, there was an article, who wrote that last year in the New York Times? Stieglitz, I can't remember. One of the Clinton people sort of said this, like, oh, we didn't realize everything that we were going to do, like everything that was going to happen, especially around like questions around trade and globalization, that like we had no idea it would have the impact that it did. And like certainly Clinton, they've said that about like Clinton has tried to walk back certain stuff around crime that like they didn't know at the time that it would have like that like the 1994 Crime Act would lead to the levels of incarceration that it has or something. So I mean, those are places there's some like acknowledgement of changes, but less so on some of these market principles. They've never said like, I mean, I guess I don't know. Obama's in a little bit of like around tech, like, but less so from the economic dislocation and more that like it's the problems that what it's doing like as a threat to democracy.
At least in terms of what they're talking about, there's not a big push for mass incarceration. I mean, there's quite a big change there, right?
Yeah, and that's I think there's been cultural shifts, and I think some of this has been like a more vocal and left that has pushed the party on certain issues. So that's one I think that's one that you've seen a real like a real change around from the kind of the 90s.
Norman, do you want to get in here?
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought up the word opportunity because it seemed that was really a big one for Clinton when he was campaigning. And it's seems like I don't want to like exaggerate, but it seems like a very anti-socialist idea. And it's sort of together with it sometimes even said by the more explicit ideologues is that we don't have any responsibility for results. We're just offering opportunity.
Yeah, I think there's this idea of like, I mean, opportunity to me is like a very like like it's a very it's a word that's like intrinsically tied to capitalism because it's like this idea of like who like I mean both like who can get ahead, like that the capitalist economy will provide particular kinds of opportunities. Another one I think that's important is that like you can see this idea of the like the ways in which it's tied to particular narratives of upward mobility, but like yes, that like and I think it goes to like everyone can have the opportunity to succeed, but that doesn't mean actually like the guarantee of results from that. So you know, and it's interesting, like opportunity is actually like it's at the heart of like a lot of the great society language is one of opportunity too. And like I think it depends too. Like I've thought about this like with that term, like you want it's like opportunity to do what? Like because
Yeah,
like we should
yeah,
all
yeah.
have certain kinds of opportunity, like you know, opportunities in certain areas, but I think it's like opportunities in these particular kind of
Well,
arenas.
arguably, Lyndon Johnson was serious about ending poverty, and arguably, whatever they said as a practical matter, in the real world, the Clinton kind of politics doesn't seem that was serious unless it's sort of a fantasy.
Yeah, I think they were serious about it. I don't know if it was like their major, but I think that like what that is like what I look at. I mean, they were committed to it as this idea, this is something, and it's a, and I think it's also the idea that you can like solve poverty is like this very technocratic like
Yeah.
idea. But I think the other side of it is that like other priorities took precedent. So and I think the other one is like the idea, you know, I talk in the book a lot about these ideas of like win-wins. And things that can do both. Like that was always the constant, like we can do both things. So and without the idea that like actually to address certain things like poverty and inequality like has to lead to like win loses. So that logic plays out.
So underneath that is an ideological question of is the market capable of ending poverty?
I mean, personally, what I think.
Well, it seems like
um,
underneath this is contrasting suppositions politically of whether poverty could be ended by relying on market.
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes back to the question of like this is like sort of what seems to be circulating around, but is like I think that the whole of like did this work or not, or is this trickle down economics? Like it's been proven over and over again, like the market by itself cannot solve inequality or poverty.
Yeah.
Like it should not, we should not be looking at, I mean, I always say this, like I think I say this in the book, but I've said it before, like you should not look at the thing that causes inequality to solve it. Like or so that's
Yeah.
like some of the I think some of the questions. Um but like that so like that sort of is producing a huge amount of the problem.
Yeah.
One comment in the chat is simply that Clinton wanted to, quote, balance the budget. And this does seem to be the recurring cycle. You get a Democratic president, they will not tax rich people, but they will balance the budget. And then you get a Republican who couldn't care less about that, but still won't tax rich people, right? And so, what I mean, isn't sort of the failure to tax wealth, to tax the super rich as inequality is growing, the big sin of omission, even beyond all these stupid little sins of commission that Clinton is engaged in then?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a so Clinton did they did impose a marginal tax increase in 1993. So you see some of you do see some like but nothing to the scale of like would have been possible. I think more like I think the bigger question is actually like around deregulation. And so it's both like taxing, I mean, in this question around taxing the rich, but I think more like I think that like the intense amounts of deregulation that happened over the course of the 1990s skews even further. So I think that if you wanted to kind of create some of those questions around like equality and also not deal with a balanced budget, it has to do with more with like, you know, the 90s. I can like I can name them off, but all of the kind of major deregulations that happened, which was the idea that it would create more competition, but instead, like what you see happening is these just like the amalgamation of these huge bank forms and then also huge media conglomerates that take hold from that process. So that also sort of like imbalances the economy in all kinds of ways.
For most people these days who aren't in that top 1 or 5%, healthcare is increasingly a burden if you can have it at all, if you can have the questionably valuable insurance at all. And there was this real opportunity to do something about healthcare. And Paul Wellstone had, surveyed everybody and said, oh, they want single payer, let's do it. But that, I mean, that was a huge blow that the Clintons imposed on us, wasn't it?
Yeah, it's worth asking, like, that, I mean, I think this moment of that is an opportunity in the particular approach that they took. Or like, I mean, I think some of the issues was like yeah, and like not deciding just at the outset, like not pursuing single payer healthcare, like would have that like the Overton, that was the moment for the Overton window, and you had popularity, like popular support for it. I think they ran scared a number of different ways, and I think one of the problems is like the program they did produce was so complicated, that, and actually I will say, like, even in some ways like less market oriented than what Obama, like what the Affordable Care Act was. So like even if they had passed, like what was passed was actually even further, like a further market-based solution than even in the 90s. So yeah, I do think there's a question of like, was that the possibility or moment, and like what has been, as we've seen that play out time and time again. And I think also, I mean, the interesting question is like the ways that despite like the ACA playing a role in their life, it's so complicated that it has produced like other kinds of alienation with both that program and the Democrats.
You cite that there are sometimes these comments, we didn't know that a policy of locking everybody up would end up locking everybody up and so on. But there are people in this book that you document who understood exactly what was needed at the time and said so. The Reverend Jesse Jackson, who we lost this year, is throughout saying, here's what you're doing wrong, here's what we should do, in real time, right? So it's not as if they didn't know.
Yeah, I think there's a question of like it's about priorities and choices. And so that goes to the same thing. I mean, one thing I look at a lot with Jesse Jackson was like, and this goes to like the discussion in the book around the Democratic Leadership Council, so about like political priorities. So like they made like they made choices. So it's not to say, and so one of this is that like instead of trying to focus on winning over marginalized groups or people who are disaffected voters, instead we'll go after affluent swing voters. So that was like a policy, that was a decision. So both ideas were on the table, and the Democrats made a clear priority choice. And I think you can see that in a number of different arenas. I mean, interestingly, with Jesse Jackson, he also aligns himself with Clinton by the end, and like supports a lot of the kind of like in the last chapter of the book is them coming together. So he's a complicated figure in his own right of like his position. But I think you can see where like these other ideas of doing, Jackson would talk about like a Marshall Plan for America, and like doing like real investment, and like that never comes to any form of fruition.
I see there's a question or a point on the chat about Clinton foreign policy, and at the time, in real time, there was a letter from even very centrist or military industrial people telling Clinton, do not expand NATO. This is going to be a catastrophe. I think George Kennan was among them, but he went right ahead. I mean, it looks really ugly in retrospect.
Yeah, I mean that's another thing of like the kind of 90s, and I don't go into foreign policy as much in the book. I do think actually like the question, like, but I do think a driving force, and I like is actually like where you can see Clinton's the economic priorities like as
Mm.
the major driving agenda. And I think, I mean, it's worth not I'm just finished the semester teaching class at so today was the last day of my class on Cold War America. And I think one thing with the 90s is also this moment of like the post Cold War, that like the post Cold War moment. And that also goes to priorities, like in some ways, like not, it wasn't a total blank slate, but like there were possibilities for different kinds of configurations to come into the forefront. And Clinton's so promote, I mean, so the ideas of globalization and trade, being kind of at the center of the and driving force in foreign policy has other and very long-term implications as well.
Like Ron Brown and all this, and we're going to merge foreign policy and economic policy. Yeah,
Absolutely. And that like through economic policy, we can get some of our foreign policy priorities and sort of spreading democracy, like in democratization and other kinds of programs like that. So I think that that's like some of the things you really see.
yeah, yeah. A phrase comes to mind, corporate capture. I mean, how much does corporate capture describe what has happened to the Democratic Party beginning in the early 90s.
Well, I think it's there, but I think part of it, like as I argue, is like part of the corporate capture is this faith that the capture, like that these companies can do good things. So like it's not so like they can serve
Mm.
our larger purposes. So if you asked, like still a belief in like creating, an ideas of equality, of democracy, of the kind of things that the Democrats have long stood for, but like it's we can do it through these means.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was struck in the book. I don't know if this was the earliest example, but one was the loss by Dukakis, where I don't think they used the word autopsy that we like to use. We're currently trying to get an autopsy on the most recent Democratic presidential loss published, but that there's always the foreordained conclusion that, well, he didn't go far enough to the right. He did, and these people go on and manage to lose almost inconceivably to people like George W. Bush and Donald Trump, and then draw the same conclusion. You have to move more to the right. How, I don't know the history of who was doing honest autopsies after some of these elections, but how do they manage to always get the same conclusion?
Well, I think that's something I don't necessarily talk about in the book, but I've written about like now in later projects. I mean, I think there's also this way that like you see the rise of like consultants and pollsters really having a say, and this like the way in which like this highly technical idea that you don't like. I mean, you go away from kind of mass mobilization or like sort of building out. I think this is a problem too of like there's a book by two colleagues of mine called Hollow Parties, where like the Democratic Party basically becomes hollowed out. And so some of that has to do with this like focusing on like targeting particular kinds of groups and people and not thinking about a bigger idea. But that's consistently what's happened. And so one I've looked at, like having spent a lot of time looking at the suburbs, is like Democrats are consistently, and this is not from it starts I mean there's a little bit of an 88, but you really see it 96 is like that suburban women are like the future of like that's how we win over elections. So we target these moderate swing voters, like that's like where the like that's in these tight elections, like that's where you turn to. Um and you kind of go you keep focusing on them, and we've seen that play out time and time again. This is still this question right now of like that's the future of the party, is like we have to win over these moderate voters at the center. And I think one thing that's happened is like that has had certain short-term political gains, but like it actually leads to like it is made having a like any kind of stable coalition very difficult. I think it's also had really really important policy long-term policy consider like implications.
Have
Yeah.
you looked at all over the same period of time at what was done in other Western so-called democracies? Because it seems like this trend of destroying everything on purpose and moving to the right and defunding everything except wars took decades to hit in Europe. I mean that Europe didn't do this to itself as early as the U.S. did.
I mean, in some ways, like, so I look in the book, like, actually, there was this whole effort amongst, like, so the Democratic Leadership Council, who, like, and their ideas of, like, the third way and to make the way, like, a global phenomenon. So I think you start to see, like, a lot of these kinds of alliances and actually, like, clear parallels with what happens in the United States with the Democratic Party to what's going on in Great Britain, with Labor and Tony Blair, and then also in places like Germany. So those places, I think you can actually see a similar kind of parallel where you have this kind of moderate democratic, like even though labor was called labor, like they weren't, like they weren't trying to like uplift workers, or they were working like upworking like tech workers. But I think that that is where you can kind of see certain kinds of parallels happening. So I do think there are parallels going on, and it's an interesting thing. I didn't look at it in the book as much as I probably should have, and would like to do more of it.
But simultaneously or on a delay of decades?
I mean, I think it's happening simultaneously in the UK and in Germany. Like you see similar kind of political constellations coming forward, and they're working together. They're having these conferences, or they're talking. They're constantly meeting and sort of selling this idea of like we are promoting an alternative. Their idea was like we're an alternative to like both the left and the right. I mean, that was what they were selling as as the
Mm.
possibility. And so that we're not the neoliberalism of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, nor are we like like basically nor are we like the social democrats. Like we are something that are we have this alternative idea that can be really successful. I mean, I think what happens is like what takes the it's not even Clinton, it's like the what really ends that is post 9/11, and that those kinds of visions just don't hold up the same way that they did in the 90s.
But in terms of the achievement of the rate of inequality, of the level of inequality, who's keeping pace with the U.S.?
You mean in terms of, I don't know those numbers off the top of my head, but I mean, you have the United States has an extremely high rate of inequality going forward, but I can't say it off the top of my head. I'm sorry.
I don't I may be wrong, but I don't think any other wealthy country is at the level of the U.S.
Well, it seems to be a race to the bottom. I mean, just what's happening in defense, they keep using the word defense spending, but from 2%, now they're supposed to, pushed by Trump, supposed to go up to 5%. I mean, it's decimating the social spending safety net in a lot of European countries. What I was going to mention is there's a word that seemed to come up under Clinton and afterwards that we don't hear that much, but it seems to be operative, and that is the word triangulation. And even though the DLC doesn't exist, there is, as you mentioned, the third way and these other groups. It keeps being rebottled, old wine in new bottles. But isn't triangulation basic to the way the Democratic Party's been run? It's anti-left and it's purportedly anti-Republican.
Yeah, I think there's this idea. I mean, so that's this idea. Like, so third way was like the positive vision of like triangulation comes from Dick Morris, who's like,
Yeah.
so I mean, I think that but it's basically what they're doing is like, I mean, his thing was like we steal the left and the right's best issues, and so that I think it's often falsely told because Clinton had long supported welfare to work, like since he was governor of Arkansas. So it's not like all of a sudden he was like, we got to steal this
Yeah.
issue. But
Yeah.
he did that was this idea of like we diffuse them by taking away their best issues. And so I think more is this idea of, like we are this alternative, and like that goes to this kind of strand right now of Democrats who sell this idea that like moderate, like if we don't we show ourselves that we're not the crazy we're not the crazy like woke activists and we're not like
Mhm.
Trump, that will appeal to this group of kind of like average middle class voters. And so that does come from the kind of the come I do think comes out of this idea that worked for Clinton in the 90s, and we can continue to kind of use that as a strategy. I would say it's more of a political strategy than like I don't know, maybe it's true like there for people who that's like their political ideology or political vision. I don't know, so that's maybe I'm naive, but that's sort of where I see it play out is like as like a political strategy.
It's a tactical
Yeah,
fixation, maybe. Yeah.
but which speaks to me about the fact that like I mean I always say this about Democrats, like is like this I think the problem right now for Democrats, and this comes to like the Clinton, some of the like legacy of Clinton too, is like not actually standing for something. So I think that's why so many voters are so frustrated, is like if you're only
Yeah.
anti these other two groups, like that's not actually standing for anything on your own. And so I think that's another thing that like when the question of like what happened or why people are frustrated is that like they didn't like it's not there's no kind of vision. I think the other thing, and I didn't say this of like another kind of legacy of the Clinton time, and I'm just like pontificating, but the is I mean another piece of like this ideology or we see is like also like the like actually rhetoric around anti-government. And so that's a form of triangulation, but like works in various different ways. So Clinton, you mentioned like the turning away from the New Deal, but like famously, set like famously has the idea of like the era of big government is over. And like
Right.
that is like, but I think that is like produced a particular kind of like very long term and very corrosive discourse, that it is incumbent upon subsequent generations of Democrats right now to fight back against.
Yeah, for sure.
Bill
For
Clinton
sure.
today was showing up in New York City for the groundbreaking of some addiction treatment center. And it struck me as, isn't this a guy whose career was devoted to shutting things down, not opening new things? Does he just go with the times, or are we supposed to think he's different from what he was?
I mean, I would like to believe. I think there's some part of me that like there people have a capacity for it to change. So I don't know. I mean, that you evolve. I don't like that's like some, but so that's my nice way of thinking about that. But I think that the other piece of it that you start to see is that like this kind of adaptation in various different ways. And in some ways, like I think there's the kind of like this happened actually. So I think a race where you can see this play out of like the different places, the Mamdani, like the primary in New York. And like he didn't like the like his siding with Cuomo like did not age very well. So I think there's a question of like where actually going in the moment is. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting to me. Like I always find it fascinating, like when he's brought in, like when he is or isn't like the one of the marquee speakers, the DNC says something. So it was amazing to me that he was like back, like he was like back this in 2024, and that kind of said that spoke something. And actually, I had to fact check it for the New York Times, but he has given like the most speeches to the Democratic to a convention of any like person by far. So it's an interesting fun fact.
I'm sort of wondering what the impact is on the general public consciousness of a wonderful book like Left Behind that details what some of these people did when they held power. And later, what people seem to understand about them seems to be just very vague and mythical. I mean, we have Obama today, opening this Obama shrine for hundreds of millions of dollars, 800, $900 million from the wealthiest plutocrats in the country, and it's all about what a great guy he is compared to Trump. Of course, George W. Bush is now your friendly neighbor who paints portraits or whatever. This is what they do, but how do historians get facts into this mix?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I mean, I think there's like the power of certain kinds of mythology or certain kinds of people get, this kind of remaking in various different ways. So I think some of it is like writing books, trying to write articles, like teaching classes. Like I think that's, I mean, like I think that it's like a kind of change, like sort of change it, like taking opportunities to change the conversation or just be sort of more think about more critical. So I don't know. I'd be curious about your thoughts or the audience's thoughts about that too. Like how do we kind of combat certain kind of there's interesting like nostalgia. I guess some of it for me, I mean, I guess, and I keep going back to the question of like why I wrote this book, but like one of the things is like I very much came of age in the 90s, and so like one of the things that that's like when I was and then or came of political age, and then also like in the 2000s under Obama, like so it's like those are like the presidents of which like my teenage versus like young adult years were shaped by. And I think some of it is like what I understood or didn't understand at the time is really important. Like that's one thing I've been trying to kind of make sense of, or how these moments came to sort of fundamentally shape my own, like all of our political moments. Or so that's one place I've kind of gone back to or tried to get people to think through.
Well, I think it's really valuable. I mean, that's one of the very valuable aspects of the Left Behind book is that just to cite, I mean, Orwell said, "Those who control the past control the future," or you can go to Faulkner, "The past isn't past." I mean, this is continuity, even if it's never recognized. And having also been attentive during the '90s, I was struck by reading an interview with Gavin Newsom by most accounts, very has a great shot, of course, as being the nominee. And he used very similar language to Bill Clinton. He talked about, he used the word responsibility, that people had to exercise responsibility if they were going to benefit from government programs. And then I did some Googling around, and Bill Clinton's been boosting Newsom for decades, back when he was running for mayor of San Francisco.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, I'm surprised, and it's also been a fascinating one. I mean, I think that so that like Newsom is definitely trying to carry on the mantle of some of these kinds of agendas. I mean, I think there's an interesting question of like and I guess I say this as like someone like living in California and watching it play out. It's been fascinating given like what he has the ways he's shifted around so much. I mean, so there's a issue, but yes, I think that you can see this tenor very much like as like a through line throughout Democratic Party politicians, and then frankly policy too, like the idea of that of like that's not just a like some of the stuff. I mean, so going back to the question of like responsibility, which I think I say in the book, like it's in like every one of Clinton's bills. Like I said, basically, yes, like so the word
Yeah.
responsibility in it, like it's like all the bills in the 90s have responsibility in them. but it's not just like it's not like a political line like that had meaning to it. Like they actually held people to this idea of like responsibility. I mean, so this notion of like I think about it, like if you were incarcerated, you couldn't get access to public housing or like visit your relatives, and if you've been convicted of a felon, like live or visit your relatives basically in public housing. And that has real policy implications to it, and that's like where I think there needs to be more like attention to kind of pushing back against some of those ideas, some of those principles and ideas.
Yeah.
Is there any hope of getting the idea advanced of responsibility by the politicians? I mean, when you have Obama come in and say, "Forget anything Bush or Cheney did; they're off the hook. Forget anything the bankers did; we'll bail them out. Screw the rest of you." And I'm gonna, go through a list of people on Tuesdays and pick who to kill. And now he's telling us presidents have too much power. We need to take away power from president. Like, how about responsibility for them?
Well, I think I totally agree with that, that like, I think there's and that's the thing of like turning the language of responsibility of like who actually is held responsible and not. And that goes back to like the question around like taxing the rich or corporate welfare. Like, it's like we talk about like corporate, but it's like, it's actually like, or like corporate responsibility, as key ideas. But I think some of this goes to like, I mean, not putting just faith in politicians like that are actually, it's more about like building out mass movements, and like that's actually what calls people to accountable, but also like then we're not like turning to some of these figures so much that like part of it is like really having a more sort of mass and collective movements.
Yeah. That's crucial, really.
There's maybe time for one more question from the chat, which is what do you think of Ruhl Schiller's diagnosis that after the white working class left the Dems in the early 80s, assuming that happened, the party was more of a rump coalition of affluent suburban whites and minority causes? Your responses, and is it beyond repair?
No, I don't think I mean, I think so. Like my first book is looking extensively at this group of like affluent suburbanites and their role in the Democratic Party. And I think they do hold like disproportionate power within the Democratic Party and have. I don't think the party is just or ever has been like you've watched this happen where it's like this kind of like what is it like kettlebell almost of like what's happened to it. But there still are a lot of white working class people who support the Democratic Party. I think there's a lot of working class people in general who support the Democratic Party. And it's like how we take expansive definitions of these terminologies. I don't believe it's beyond repair. Like I think that there's a lot of ways. I think for the Democrats to create more programs that show that that benefits everybody is the way to kind of rebuild a coalition around that. And that has been proven over historically like a really powerful way to build back power, but like build back sustainable power. And so, as I said, like I think one of the things is like not just focusing on like the short-term payoffs of like them just winning the midterms, which like maybe Democrats are going to looks like you're going to do anyway. So but instead like actually thinking about like long-term mass mobilization and mass movement,
And
and that
maybe
will help.
governance
Yeah.
and policy accomplishments that make people's lives actually
Yes,
better.
I think that's some of the things too. I mean, that goes exactly like that. I think that like it comes from having a vision and a policy priorities that do things that actually like improve people's lives. And so that is like should be the main focus going forward. So like doing that, I think does actually like lead voters and lead voters to support you. So
Norman, how many of your burning questions have been asked? Where we're running out of minutes.
Well, a few, but that's a testimony to how excellent this book is. So I'm sure if people read it, hopefully they will, you'll have a lot of questions that you'll pursue answering yourself.
Lily, it's a wonderful book. What have we failed to ask? What do you want people to know? And how can people be in touch with you and follow what you're doing?
yeah, oh, what appeal? I mean, I think that the last point, I mean, some of the things that like I often think that we focus a lot on like like who's going to win elections and parties, but like really the focus should be policy and sort of understanding like policies that actually can change people. And one thing I always say is like the power that policy can have and government can have. And one thing of watching as government has been so hollowed out in especially the last year, like it really makes a difference in people's lives. So that's one thing that I hope people get from this, and not market oriented policies, but like ones that are actually uh, putting putting government programs first. I would say the other side of it for just following me is I'm on Blue Sky and X, so you can follow me there. You can and then just read my the books and articles that I produce when I'm not teaching or taking care of my children. So um, that's those are the best things to do.
Very, very glad that you're doing it and highly recommend this one, Left Behind by Lily Geismer. And it is called Left Behind, the Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality. May it not fail forever. Um, Lily Geismer, thanks very, very much for coming on the book club. Thanks to Norman Solomon. Thanks to Bill Lacamacker for helping us out, and to everybody for asking great questions.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it, and all of you for listening.
Mm.
See you next month.